It may be a good time to pause the video to read the 5 slides of the press release before video footage of the actual press conference.
Thank you all very much for coming today. My name is Susan Smith. I'm a co-director of Women Scotland, and we are delighted and honoured to be hosting 2 British Olympians today. Sharron Davies is a swimmer who was selected aged 13 to represent Great Britain at the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal. The following year she won 2 bronze medals in the 1977 European Championship. In 1978, aged 15, she won gold medals at the Commonwealth Games 200 and 400 metres individual medley. She held the Commonwealth record for the 400 metre individual medley for 18 years. She took the silver medal in the 400 metre medley in the 1980 Moscow Olympics, behind East German Petra Schneider, who later admitted that the victory was drug-enhanced. In the 1993 New Year's Honours, Sharron was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire for services to swimming. Mara Yamauchi is a long-distance runner who became a full-time athlete at the age of 33 after a decade working as a diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She won the bronze medal in the 2006 Melbourne Commonwealth Games, 10,000 metres, winning the 2008 Osaka Ladies Marathon, finishing runner-up in the 2009 London Marathon and finishing 6th at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Thank you both for travelling up to be with us today. We really appreciate it. We're also joined by Fiona from Fair Play for Women, who have been doing a great deal of work on sporting fairness across the UK. As many of you will know, the Scottish Parliament is currently considering legislation that will allow anyone over the age of 16 to change their sex in law. So any man who says he identifies as a woman will be able to change his legal status by making a simple statutory declaration. For Women Scotland have grave concerns about the potential consequences of this law on women's hard-won rights, including the impact on women's sport. Last month, MSPs took evidence on this the impact of this law on sport. They heard from 2 male witnesses representing Sport Scotland and Leap Sport Scotland. However, they did not take evidence from any female athletes, the very people who might be impacted. And that's why we wanted to invite Sharron and Mara here today. We know that rates of participation in sport are lower for women and girls than they are for men and boys. The gap in participation starts to widen at puberty. According to Women in Sport, nearly 60% of girls are not meeting exercise guidelines. A 2015 Sport Scotland report suggested that offering single-sex sports opportunities can help build confidence and can also be essential to ensure that women from religious and racial minorities can participate. Sport matters, whether at the elite or grassroots level. And I'd like to invite Sharron to make some comments.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be back up here. I Scotland, especially Glasgow recently, I've done so many sporting events. It's always such a treat to be up here. I even get on their bikes every time I'm up. For me, this is a passion that comes from competing for, well, as you heard, a decade against East Germans. Young East German girls were put through male puberty, which is a horrendous thing, and they were given old-fashioned Steronabol and testosterone. And it showed when the wall came down that all the records could prove that they could make a 9% improvement on these young girls. And in the Olympics that I won my silver medal, being one of only 2 people outside of the Eastern Bloc that won medals, they took 90% of the women's medals and only 5% of the men's. And this was with a 9% benefit. Now, male to female performance at the Olympic Games is between 10 and 30%. 30% being things like weightlifting, anything that's very explosive, to sort of middle distance running at about 10%, and a lot of things in between, cycling, swimming, 12, 14%. Long jump, high jump again around the 20s. So it's absolutely massive. And if we enable males to be in female sports, you are excluding females from their own category of sport. Now, sport is exclusionary by nature. The whole reason we have the under-10s is so that the under-10s can race and that 12-year-olds don't go in there and win. The reason why we have so many categories in the Paralympics is so that we can enable people with different disabilities to have fair competition. In boxing, we have weight categories. All of these things are exclusionary because we're trying to create fairness in sport across society. If we enable people to identify into female sport, women will be excluded from their own category of sport. And this is why I've spoken out, because I just don't want to see another generation suffer. This has nothing to do with being transphobic. This has nothing to do with wanting anyone to have the freedom to live safely, however they identify. I'm extremely pro that. I'm not pro the sort of debate where debates are closed down because people are called names. I'm pro respectful debate where we can talk about the science and talk about the impact. And so I felt that I couldn't sit back and not say anything. And it's been a very difficult, 3-4 years. And I'm very, very disappointed in the IOC. We decided not to take a scientific approach, not to look at the science. 4 years ago, I got 60 of my friends that were all Olympic medalists, all world champions, to sign a letter to the IOC asking them to do the science before they changed the rules. They took absolutely no notice of it whatsoever. And only 3 of those 60 people have ever put their head above the pulpit. I recently did a little poll on Twitter. I know it's only Twitter, but I have a very diverse following, male and female. And for 24 hours, I had 60,000 people respond. 97% said they wanted to see fair sport. Most people want to see fairness in society, and most people want to see fairness in sport. And I do not understand why our elected representatives are not listening to the people. And up here in Scotland, they need to listen to the people, because I'm sure they feel exactly the same way. There are ways that we can include everybody. We can have a female protected classification, we can have an open and inclusive classification. So no one wants anyone to be banned from sport, and nobody wants anyone to be excluded from sport. I love sport. I know what benefit it does for us physically and mentally. However, I am going to die on the hill that says I want fair sport for females, because I just believe that we deserve it. Mara, your turn.
Okay. Well, forgive me that I'm going to repeat some of Sharon's points, but that's because they're extremely important points which really do need repeating over and over until people understand. Sport used to be inclusive for everybody until gender identity ideology arrived and infiltrated the world of sport. If categories didn't exist, the only people who would get a look in would be adult, able-bodied males, since they're the group which have the greatest physical abilities. In sports like boxing, only the heaviest males would get a look in. We all recognise that sport should be for everyone, and therefore categories existed for those who have lesser physical abilities than adult able-bodied males. And by that I mean females, children, people with disabilities, and lighter individuals. These categories created fairness for everybody, not just adult able-bodied males, and therefore made sport inclusive for everybody. As we all know, fairness is the central essence of sport, and without it, sport stops being sport and instead becomes theatre. Until recently, these categories were unremarkable. Everyone accepted them and obeyed the rules. Then gender identity ideology came along, and the category of sport, by which I mean male or female, was done away with. Sports organisations everywhere created rules which allow males into female sports. Therefore, fairness and inclusion for females, which previously existed, ceased to exist. Some of these rules require males to undergo medical treatment, but in practice in the UK in many sports, access to female sport by males is purely by self-ID. This means women's sport, by which I mean sport for females only, effectively no longer exists. What continues to exist is men's sport, i.e. sport for males, and mixed sport, i.e. sport for both sexes. Whether or not males actually participate in what was women's sport is not relevant. They are allowed to currently, and therefore at any moment, one or more males could pop up and decide to participate. The end of a category exclusively for females only means the end of fairness for females, because males have massive physical advantages compared to females, which are not fully removed by testosterone suppression. Sharron has given you statistics on what those big differences amount to. Everyone knows this, even if some people pretend not to. You don't need to be a sports fan or a scientist to know this. A cursory glance at any equivalent male and female records will show that in 100% of cases, males outperform females. So sport used to be inclusive of everybody, but it no longer is. Now it is exclusive and discriminatory against females. We've all heard of Laurel Hubbard, a 43-year-old male whose inclusion in the Tokyo Olympics women's weightlifting prevented a young elite, world-class female weightlifter from becoming an Olympian, a life-changing experience. The Thunder Crit cycle race in London, held 2 weeks ago, used to have 2 categories, one for men and one for women, which meant fairness and inclusion existed for both males and females. They have now got rid of these 2 categories and replaced them with 2 categories in which males enjoy fairness and inclusion, while females have no category, which affords them fairness and inclusion. Predictably, males dominated the podiums in both categories at this race 2 weeks ago. This appalling impact on female athletes and women's sport is entirely predictable, because something which is irrelevant in sport, gender identity, has been smuggled into the rule books by people who pretend that it's the same thing as biological sex. We all know it isn't the same. What is relevant in sport is sex, age, type of disability, and in some sports, body weight. The impact on sport of using gender identity as basis for categories is the same as if we forced onto the rule books any other irrelevant category, such as how long your hair is, what religion you follow, or which party you vote for. We can all see with our own eyes what gender identity ideology has done to women's sport, and I hope that political leaders will put a stop to it now, because a lot of damage has already been done. The Gender Recognition Reform Act currently going through currently going through the Scottish Parliament will make it much easier for anyone to obtain a GRC. We can reasonably assume from this that the number of males obtaining a GRC will probably increase. The bill removes all gatekeeping from the process and simply relies on self-declaration, as Susan explained. Therefore, the males who obtain a GRC will no longer be only those with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but any male who wants one. In sport, it is already, in practice, very difficult for sports clubs and officials to turn away any male who demands to participate in women's sport. A large increase in the number of males in possession of a GRC will simply make this situation worse. We can already see the devastating impact on women's sport all across the UK of males competing in female sport. Females are routinely excluded from things of value such as podium places, prizes, points, places on teams, etc. by males in their own female category. But a much bigger problem is self-exclusion by females who see males with unfair advantages competing in their own events. Last week, a photograph circulated on social media of a young girl looking humiliated and dejected by the experience of having competed against a male in a women's competition. It's frankly a miracle that girls in this situation persevere with their sports, and I commend their courage. My question for Scottish parliamentarians is this. There will be talented, hard-working Scottish girls out there right now who could become the sports stars of the future and win medals for Scotland. Are you happy for them to quit sport altogether because they have no chance of winning against male-bodied people? I have 2 requests for the Equalities Committee, which is currently scrutinising this bill. 1, insert a clause into your bill which states unequivocally that women's sport is for those born female only, regardless of what any GRC or birth certificates say. This will provide for everyone, not just males, that magic word which we all hold so dear, inclusion. And 2, put your money, time and effort into serious work to get males in sport to be inclusive and welcoming to their gender non-conforming male peers. We saw in the spring this year Emily Bridges' fellow male athletes being wonderfully welcoming and inclusive to Bridges at the Bucks Cycling Championships in a photograph circulating on social media. If males everywhere, at all levels in all sports, would welcome and include their gender non-conforming male peers without question, then females could also enjoy fairness and inclusion without being told to budge up and give up your medals, trophies and places on teams because males are supposedly more important. Aside from female athletes, there is another group in sport which suffers exclusion because of gender identity ideology. Average males who have the decency to compete in their own male category. They compete fairly against their fellow males, but because they do not claim any special identity, They go home empty-handed. Why should they suffer when their fellow average males who claim a special identity can smash it in the female category and go home weighed down with prizes? I want to finish by talking about the development pathway. This is the process by which an individual transforms themselves from a beginner into an adult elite athlete, passing through various stages along the way, for example, county, regional, national, continental and world level. This process takes years, sometimes decades. It involves an enormous amount of hard work, training and sacrifice, not only from the athlete themselves, but from family members and supporters as well. At any point along that pathway, an athlete can and will suffer setbacks and may leave the pathway altogether. In my case, the pathway from a sporty 11-year-old with a dream to the Olympics took 24 years. Throughout that time, there were numerous setbacks and near misses, such as failing to qualify for teams, injuries, not being selected for teams, and work pressures. All of these setbacks could have pushed me off that pathway at any time. It's akin to leaping through flaming hoops continuously for years. Males competing in the female category effectively destroys the development pathway for females. Every time a male competes in women's sport, he takes from numerous female athletes things of value which otherwise would help them to progress along that pathway, such as medals, points, qualifications, places on teams, prize money and confidence. Right now, female athletes in the UK are being impeded, obstructed and pushed off this development pathway by males competing in their own category. Some people in sport, including IOC President Thomas Bach, say women's sport at elite level must be fair, but lower down and at grassroots level it must be inclusive. What this means, effectively, is two things. First, they seem to believe that elite athletes just appear from nowhere as fully formed champions, which of course is completely untrue. And second, they are happy to destroy that development pathway, which enables females to progress, improve and reach elite level. People say trans inclusion and women's sport is delicate and complicated. It's neither of these things. The solution is very simple. Males compete in male sports, females compete in female sport. By doing that, fairness and inclusion would then exist for everyone, including females. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Look who it is! You look different, you look older. Same as me, that's okay, because we feel like children when we meet each other.
Stab me in the back.
Oh, okay. So just in case anyone didn't know, Brian obviously used to run with my ex-husband, Derek. Oh, it's lovely to see you.
Nice to see you, Sharron. One of the things that is the issues that we're struggling with at the moment, as you know, is that the discussion seems to revolve around elite sport. And we can make that argument.
Absolutely.
No problem at all. The fact that, if I decided to be trans back, I'd still be a world record holder now by a considerable margin. The problem is, of course, as you alluded to, is that there is grassroots sport as well, and we've discussed this at length, Sharron, and that there are those who quite legitimately wanted to participate and find the only place they're participating in is within women's grassroots sport, and not only keeping other women out of the team, but especially in contact sport.
Yeah, very much so.
Contact sport, and I've seen it with my 13-year-old daughter competing against a full-grown male, and that there's an inherent danger that if we don't tackle this head-on and we don't deal with this, we are actually not just preventing women participating in sport, we're actually potentially putting them into a dangerous situation.
Absolutely. I mean, a male hits 160% harder than a female of an equivalent weight.
Yeah.
So if you put that in a rugby tackle, it's absolutely lethal. Not to mention actually that bone structures of biological females are also thinner and more fragile than bone structures of males. So you're putting the two worst things together. So it is a very, very serious accident waiting to happen. And it breaks my heart that we're almost having to wait for someone to break their neck before we go, this is dangerous, because we know this is dangerous. Now, World Rugby were one of the only responsible organisations in the world to say, right, we will not enable, transgender women to compete. What I find very frustrating is that the transgender community seems to think that by not being involved in the women's category, they're being banned, and no one is ever banning anybody. We both love our sport. We want everyone to be involved in sport. We know how important it is to our physical and to our mental health, which is so very, very important in a world where mental health issues are going, skyrocketing. So it's about trying to be inclusive, that everybody gets to do sport, but by excluding young girls from their sports, by putting them in dangerous situations, by not giving them role models that they can look up to, this is just, it's absolute madness. So it is the hill that I'm prepared to die on, because I just can't believe that we have to have years of males winning before we realise that they're stronger, when actually we don't need to do that, just need to look at the record books. There's not a single piece of peer-reviewed science in the whole of the world at the moment that shows that you can mitigate against male performance advantage puberty. So, if somebody has gone through male puberty, they just have this innate, and and I know, that's why we have a 4-year ban, supposedly, if someone's taking testosterone, and that's what's so ludicrous about this. We give someone a 4-year ban if they take drugs to try to cheat to get the tiniest advantage in sport. But yet women are supposed to step back and say, yes, you can have an advantage. And I don't understand that. That to me just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just incredibly frustrating. And on team sports, you are excluding people from just wanting to do recreational sport in a team as well, at grassroots levels, at social levels. So we can be inclusive by having an open category. We can be inclusive by encouraging men to be more welcoming, as Mara said, of people that identify as a different gender to the sex that they actually are. We know this happens in women's sport, because both at the NC2As and at the Olympics last year, transgender men and female non-binary identifying females all chose to compete in the women's category. They do not choose to compete in the men's category. And yet transgender women, biological males, choose to go into the women's category. And you have to ask yourself, why is that as well? So, we can, if women can be inclusive of transgender men, then I'm sure men can be inclusive of transgender women. And that's where we need to work. That's where the inclusion needs to be. Not asking women to move over to their rights. And I think also we forget that sport nowadays is a career. In our day, it wasn't quite so much of a career, but it's given us a foot up for sure, and it's certainly given me my opportunities. This is sex discrimination in the workplace as well, because sport is the ability for someone to have a career. Whether that's with your endorsements, whether that's with your opportunities on television, whether that's with your prize money. So we're turning around and we're saying, well, now that males have a bigger opportunity to have a career in sport than women do. We're actually going to, and we've worked so hard over the last only probably the last decade, to bring women's sport through. I was only listening to radio this morning about women's football and how excited we're getting about the Euros, and how, England stands England, dirty word, but stands a very good chance. And, that was, in my day, no one talked about that. We've worked so hard to get this, to get that far, to get women's sport better opportunities, and now we seem to be taking steps backwards, and it's just, yeah. We need to do more. I looked at the Times this morning. I was looking at stories on the sports pages, and there was 9 stories before we got to a women's story. 9 stories before they even mentioned the word female sport. And that happens every day almost. It's hard going.
Can I just respond to that as well? So this distinction between elite and grassroots, what people who say, yes, fairness at elite level but not at grassroots level are saying effectively is, good females deserve fairness, less good females, no, you can just do collateral damage. I totally reject that. And because of the development pathway point that I made, but also even for women who, being honest, will never be elite or even semi-elite, they deserve fairness. They care deeply about their performances. They try just as hard as any elite athlete. I know, I coach them, competition is everything for them, even if they're not very active and not near the front of any event. The second thing I would say is I absolutely agree with Sharron that sport must be inclusive for trans people. Sport is fantastic for everybody. It's great for our mental and physical health. Nobody is saying trans people should be banned from sport. And indeed, the UK Sports Council's Equality Group report last September, the SCEG report, called on NGBs to be creative about how we can include trans people and be welcoming and inclusive to them without damaging the female category. So that's what NGBs really need to be doing. We need to think creatively, make sport welcoming for everybody, but that cannot come at the expense of sport for females.
This is how crazy it is. If I was to take up swimming again tomorrow morning and go and race, and if I race with 5 nanomoles of testosterone in my blood system tomorrow, which is the amount that Emily Bridges is allowed to cycle with next week, I would receive a 4-year ban. That's how stupid it is at the moment.
So testosterone is banned for everybody in and out of competition on the WADA prohibited list. This is what Sharron's talking about. So, for females who want to be competitive, level the playing field, any amount of testosterone is banned, and yet male endogenous testosterone up to male levels in the female category is considered acceptable. It's complete madness.
Can I ask, please? There's a committee around the corner obviously considering gender reform at the moment. That's happening here, and yet you two ladies have had to come quite a long way to make this case. You're sort of disappointed that elite Scottish athletes are not coming forward and speaking
It's
out.
not just Scottish athletes, though. It really is. Everybody is scared, because the moment you try to speak out and just ask for fairness, you get called names, you get death threats, you get the PRAs ringing up your employers, trying to get you sacked, trying to get you unemployed. There's not being respectful debate on both sides of this. It has to be out in the open. It's shine the light on everything to find solutions for everybody, and that's what this has always been about from my side. It's never been about excluding trans people. It's been about promoting fair sport. And I've spoken to many Scottish athletes, many retired swimmers. I get athletes calling me every single week. I get coaches calling me every single week. I get a lot of coaches in tears because they don't know what the hell to do. They don't know how to deal with this. I think it's terribly important that governing bodies talk to their athletes. Cycling has been the worst at not asking its athletes, its female athletes in particular, what they think. They have totally and utterly ignored them. And when they went to an advisory panel to decide to check on their transgender rules, that consisted of a transgender female athlete who actually, when they were competing as a male athlete, received a drugs ban for cheating and Stonewall. And they not once asked a single female athlete. So, it's so disrespectful that we don't even get a voice in our own competitions. It's untrue, really. So, yeah, I would love to see more people coming out and speaking, and I think we're very, very strong if we speak together. And in fact, with regards to Emily Bridges, the reason that Emily didn't get to race in that particular race that we all know about was because the girls did come together behind the scenes and said, we will not race. And their coaches came together and said, we will not let the girls race. So they underestimate how powerful and strong they are, but it's difficult when you've got governing bodies telling them to be quiet, and you've got sponsors telling them to be quiet, and they're only just making enough money to pay their bills, because it's not like swimmers, and athletes and just make an absolute fortune. They really don't. They're not footballers. They make just enough money usually to pay their bills. So it is very, very tough. But the good news is that FINA this weekend, which is the world governing body, I'm very hopeful that they might bring some strong rules out. What we do need is for someone to break cover. We need a government. We need a party. We need a governing body. We've got all the evidence. We've had this wonderful report of UK Sport, which was in October last year, and it categorically, in black and white, said you cannot have inclusion and fairness in the women's category. So how is it just okay to go, then women can't have fair sport?
Can I respond to that as well? So I've followed this debate for some years, but it was only about a year ago that I started speaking out after reading a tweet from Sharron, which said, if you're silent, you're complicit in this, and she's absolutely right. I have a lot of sympathy with female athletes, especially the currently competing ones, because they have a lot to lose. Their job is to train and compete, not to make sports officials do their jobs properly. But since I've spoken out, I have had 2 fairly major abuse episodes, but to be honest, the numbers of people supporting me have been overwhelmingly greater. I have complete strangers contacting me every week to say, thank you so much for defending women's sport. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for being brave. I agree with you 100%. It's not transphobic. This is about the rights of women and girls. So my message out for female athletes out there and supporters of female athletes, fathers of daughters, people with sisters and nieces and female cousins or pupils in their classes. They can't cancel all of us. You have to speak up please, you know, we all know that there can be a personal cost attached to it, but the public opinion is very clear. Sharron did a poll of over 60,000 Twitter followers. Over 97% said no to males in female sport. There's a news story out today, More in Common, I think it's called. The think tank has done a survey on sport in particular. People are, a big majority are opposed to males in female sport. So public opinion is very much on your side. So if you're a female athlete or a concerned parent or something out there, and you think, what should I do? Please speak up. Contact For Women Scotland. Contact Fair Play for Women. Contact me or Sharron. Speak up. Tell your friends, because this is about the future of sport for half the population.
Sport Scotland have said that they don't think that the GRA reforms that are going through Parliament right now would have an impact on trans access to sport, and you've made that link to the bill today. I mean, they're saying that the gender recognition certificate won't come into play when it comes to considering who gets to compete in which category. So I just wondered if you could address that point and why you think the issue that we're talking about today is pertinent to that legislation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm sure the others will have extra to add, but one of the biggest things that we have identified and MBM have identified is the Section 22 in the GRA, which gives this heightened level of privacy to people. So it becomes almost impossible to prove whether or not someone has a GRA. And it's actually becomes a criminal offence in many situations to disclose that they have a GRC. So this is especially pertinent at grassroots. Again, at elite level, there are going to be ways where people will be able to maybe do a sex test or find these things out. But for an ordinary club, which is run by volunteers, somebody who is obviously male turning up, and with female documentation, it's very, very difficult for those people at grassroots level to say, no, sorry, you can't do it, especially as they are not getting the support necessarily from the governing bodies, and especially as the lead taken in Parliament is that these people are who they say they are. So it really needs a bit of a stronger statement, not just relying on the exceptions in the Equality Act, which actually they're permissive, so people can ignore them if they want to, and there really does need to be a stronger carve-out for sport. I'm sure.
That's good. Let's have more questions. That's great.
Yeah, no.
So that statement there, the Sport Scotland, is actually incorrect. There's a couple of people in Sport Scotland that said that, but the organisation themselves have not declared that the gender format will not impact sport. We're very, very selective about who we're picking here and who we're quoting. Sport Scotland don't think that.
Can I clarify? They said that in evidence to the committee. So
yeah, two people from Scotland, no, two representatives from Sport Scotland. They aren't Sport Scotland, they're two representatives of sport, they're not Sport Scotland. Until such times the Chief Executive comes out and says that, I'm afraid that I don't believe that at all.
So what can we do, Bram? What do you think? What is the simple thing that we can put in place that maybe needs to be added onto the legislation that would enable us to be able to enable that little volunteer at that that competition to protect the entry list, really?
Quite frankly, what we need to do is we need to have a Scottish committee that are prepared to listen to people like yourself, rather than select those people for that committee that will give them the answers that they want. I thought the committee were absolutely disgraced, and I saw that. I wasn't even invited to that committee myself. Of all the people in Parliament who could speak up on this particular subject, I wasn't invited. You weren't invited, even though your name was put forward. It was two people who actually, quite frankly, had little understanding.
I do think the SNP have to be very, very careful here, because they're not asking the right people. They're asking the people they want to hear the answers from. And the whole point is to listen to the people. But also, if you're going to have any form of select group of people, you need to have it cross-party, you need to have it cross-opinion, and you need to back it all up with 100% fact. And as much as I believe people are entitled to identify however they like, a feeling can never trump a fact. How on earth do we apply laws to a feeling? I don't understand how people can say my feeling is more important than your fact. when we don't even know how their feeling might change the next day or the next week, or where does my feeling in all of this come into this? No one ever asks the feelings of the girls that get left behind. You know, it's only about the feeling of the person who gets to usurper and go in. So, you know, I just think feelings are not what we should be basing laws or rules on.
There was an incident, sorry, I was just going to say there was an incident a couple of weeks back at the Tweedlove cycling, where it's a classic example. Their rules very specifically state that there were male and female categories and they were by birth sex. But a trans-identified individual entered the women's race, biologically male, won it, and the organisers didn't know until that person stepped onto the podium that they were in the incorrect category. And then, of course, that puts the organisers in a terribly invidious position, because they have to then go back and, if they're going to be firm on this, and say, no, you have to return that prize. And it's not something they should have to deal with, frankly. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, on that, you know, we've seen in recent years medals being reallocated and re-awarded after doping disqualifications. You know, better late than never, but these athletes have all missed out on a life-changing event in as much as getting the medal at the event where you competed. And for females to be rung up by an event organiser, you know, 6 weeks later and said, oh, actually, we've discovered that the person who won shouldn't have been there. You know, here you are, I'll send you your medal in the post. This is totally unacceptable. We've seen it because of doping. This cannot happen. Females who win something fair and square, whether it's a medal or a place or whatever it is, they must receive that on the day. Coming back to Brian's point about the bill, self-ID is causing massive problems in women's sport now, and if the bill passes, the message that will come from the Scottish Parliament is that this government endorses self-ID, including in sport, and I think that just sends totally the wrong message, because, you know, without getting into details about whether you present a GRC or not at a sports event, I think it sends totally the wrong message.
Fire away.
Yeah, Maya mentioned sort of self-exclusion and the dangers of that. I was wondering if you could just say a bit about how you think you would have felt before you were an Olympian, you know, when you were a sort of...
Yeah, well, see, that's the really interesting thing, because obviously this is exactly how I felt, because obviously I was competing against East Germans every single day. You know, all of my medals are bronzes and silvers behind East Germans, every single one of them. And every time I stood on that podium, I knew that they were cheating and they shouldn't have been there. And yet nothing was done. You know, we had the most amazing female athlete in a lady called Kathy Smallwood, who was just the most incredible. I mean, her British record for the 400 was only beaten by Christina Horrigu not that long ago. She would have been such a household name. She's a teacher in the Midlands. You know, I had friends that came fourth behind 3 East Germans. No one had ever heard of them. And they would have been Olympic champions. And I know Mara then talked about, you know, re-giving people medals. Actually, we wouldn't be able to reallocate anybody's medals, because these people that are racing right now under these rules are not breaking any rules. So no one can turn around and go, well, you shouldn't have that medal, we're going to give it to that person, because actually they're not breaking a rule by being in there. So it's so frustrating that you know, that nothing was done. And nothing, the IOC did nothing for 20 years. And when the wall came down and all the evidence was there, they still did nothing. And they're still doing nothing now. And they, you know, and these poor girls that were given these drugs, they let down 2 groups of society. You know, these girls that were fed these terrible drugs, and many of them had died. And then people like myself, you know, who missed out on the medals that they should have got, you know. And so the IOC are not the temple to hold up as the way to do things. We've only got to look at Sochi and what little they did about Sochi, and the Russians taking drugs, you know, after the Olympics, the Winter Olympics. They did nothing. They constantly passed the buck. So what's happened in sport, the IOC has passed the buck, and you know, the international committees have sat there like this, going, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. I'm just very much hoping that Fiona, I should be so proud of Fiona the first to step up this weekend, you know, and actually do something, but we're going to have to wait and see until Sunday to see what they do. And then I'm just hoping that everyone will fall in along behind, you know, and just go, right, this is what we should be doing, this is the gold standard. But we should not be waiting 10 years until a load of girls have lost before we go, this is a mistake. And that's what I was trying to stop by speaking up.
I can answer that question as well. So I self-excluded because of doping. So when I was competing, there was a big group of athletes who I suspected were doping, and many of them were caught. And I chose events thinking, are members of this group likely to show up at this event? Because I'm sick of having to face unfair competition. And it was also a big factor in my decision to retire. I just thought, I'm sick of this. You know, I'm getting on, I'm going to retire. I'm done with unfair competition. So the same will apply to females facing males in their own category. And right now, I know of a group of females who are self-excluded from events because of males competing, and some of them are considering quitting altogether. I'm not mentioning any names and I'm not mentioning the sport, but I know of self-exclusion going on right now.
It's very disheartening
Can
to
I make
feel
a
like you don't
observation?
matter.
Yeah, we hear from women and girls across a whole range of sports right across the UK. I've talked to students in Scotland who are potentially on the track to be professional footballers. I've talked to cyclists. I've talked to a bunch of different sports women. Sometimes we talk to their parents, occasionally their coaches. And lots of these girls are saying to us, do you know, if I have to face that person, I'm just not going to play that weekend. So if it's a team sport, they'll say, I think I'll have to just pretend that I'm not fit or pretend that I'm not available, because they daren't say that they don't want to play in an unfair competition. So the pressure, back to your point from earlier, the pressure on these young women to be nice, to be inclusive, to be accommodating of males in their teams and in their opposition is a disgrace. We're the adults. And luckily, we're in a position where we can say, do you know what, that's not fair. I can be kind. But there are limits here, and I'm going to be kind to these girls. So you might think that this is not a big problem. And it's easy to focus on the visible examples and when you see someone on the podium. But we know that particularly for teenage girls, this is happening everywhere, every day. And we really have to show some leadership here. And, you know, it's good to see one politician here. I'd like to see a bit more leadership.
Can I add to that? You can self-exclude if you know that there's going to be a male in the event that you're planning. If you don't know,
Yes.
you turn up and you think, ooh, that person looks a bit manly, you know. I know of an event recently in which a male competed. I'm not mentioning the sport. This person passes very well. I imagine all the females in that event were completely unaware that they were being subjected to unfair competition. They couldn't self-exclude. They weren't aware.
Can I ask a question? At the time that you were competing, Sharron, there was a javelin thrower who was a huge success, Fatima Whitbread, of course. Now, I remember the newspaper articles that were written about her because she looked, as you put it, perhaps more manly than other female competitors. She had a lot of stress.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you differentiate, or how do you expect grassroots people to differentiate between some sporty women
and
who are
exactly,
you know,
and that's why the rules need to be very clear. We need to have the rules need to be very clear. They need to be very straightforward. There needs to be no ambiguity. No sort of soft edges. We just need to go female protected class, female at birth, female sex. I get really upset, because a lot of the TRAs will talk to me about how intrusive it is to start looking at gender. No one I had a sex test in 1976 when I went to the Olympics, right? It was a 3-second swab on the inside of my cheek. That was it. It was less stressful than a COVID test, believe me. And it was never done again, because you cannot change your sex. So once that sex test was done and put into a little jar and I was given the F, that was it. It's utter rubbish to say that these things are intrusive. It's just another way to say how degrading this would be. It's not degrading to have a swab on the inside of your cheek, that you only have once in your life. And Fatima well and truly had one of those because she was competing during that era. If you are going to be a javelin thrower, you are probably not going to look like a ballet dancer. We're all different shapes and sizes in sport, and it's so wrong to judge people by their external appearance. And that's why, again, we want to go back to sport being about the biological sex, not about what you being look like. We live in a world where we are enforcing stereotypes, and it breaks my heart as a mother of a 24-year-old daughter. Lucky Grace has done sport, and she's really very sensible and very balanced. But a lot of young girls are thinking that if they don't look like Kim Kardashian, they must be a boy. I never looked like that. I was climbing trees and knocked my teeth out. I was playing football with the boys, training with the boys all the time, up a tree. Sex is not how feminine or masculine you are. Sex is a biological reality, and we seem to be losing sight of that. And you know, that's really where sport needs to be, the biological reality.
I think the vagueness of the situation invites bad feeling and suspicion. And you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a manly-looking female.
Or a feminine-looking guy.
Yeah,
you know, absolutely.
but you know, if there's a manly-looking female at an event, and we're in this current situation where it's a sort of free-for-all, that is going to invite people to say, oh, you know, is that a male in my race? And maybe submit a complaint to the organiser. This is not helpful for anybody. Therefore, Sharon's absolutely right. Absolutely clear rules are needed and need to be enforced, so that everybody can participate in sport at any level, confident that the males are in the male category, the females are in the female category, end of. And then, you know, you don't need to get into debates about what people look like or, you know, what their muscles look like, anything like that.
There was an unverified report on Twitter last night that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport may be considering legislating on this. Does it need politicians to actually...
Yes, it does.
Because the sporting bodies seem reluctant to do so. Does it need political action?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I went into Westminster, very much like I've come up today, you know, but I went into Westminster about a month ago and had a chat with quite a few different people. And again, you know, when you talk to people, they're all, oh yes, we understand, and oh yes, something should be done, but nobody's doing anything. There's all the talking in the background and all the agreeing, but no, everyone is sitting on their hands, and we actually just need some politicians to be brave and to take some action, and to go that, you know, 51% of this country is female. We deserve to be looked after the same as those that are male in sport. And, you know, it has a knock-on in everything. And yes, please, you know, politicians do something, you know, give the guidance. We had a wonderful report which came from UK Sport, and it was such a shame that they didn't grasp that by the nettle back in October. And instead of throwing it back to the NGBs and saying, okay, you can't have fair sport and inclusion, now decide what you're going to do, they should have just said, we cannot have fair sport and inclusion, prioritise fairness. That's what they should have done.
We're probably going to have to wrap up quite soon, so are there any quick questions?
Yeah, just a really quick one. You've obviously spoken mostly about fairness when you're competing, but do you have any concerns about sort of loss of single-sex spaces and things like changing rooms, and might that be a factor that would put girls off?
Absolutely, I'm sure it does. You know, particularly with sort of you know, minority groups and religious groups and things. I mean, it certainly impacts on, you know, the Asian women who want to swim, Jewish women, you know, definitely minority groups who are very staunchly not prepared to share a changing room with someone of the opposite sex. So, you know, again, we are including but excluding, and that's what we have to be really careful of. You know, who are we excluding by these new rules? But I tend to stick on sport because I know it really well. I know all the science, you know, I've done an awful lot of research on it, so I'm going to leave all of that to the other ladies to talk about.
Yep.
Yeah, just, you've come all the way up to do this press conference. Do you want to appear before the committee?
If they ask me, I spoke to Brian. Brian was on the phone to me, what, a month ago? Yeah. And said, would you? And I said, absolutely, I would happily do it. You know, because again, I have so many people that do speak to me, and I feel like a bit of a conduit at the moment because they are frightened to speak out for themselves. Yeah. So, you know, I feel like I'm speaking for a lot of my... I've spoken to quite a few Scottish swimmers, as you'd imagine, very successful swimmers, you know, and they would not speak out. They are scared of how it would impact them.
I wrote to the committee after their sport evidence session, and I've just received a reply saying they're not going to be holding any further sessions on sport.
What do you say to that?
They need to listen to female athletes, and they need to listen to people who care about women's sport.
I think that's us saying thank you. I'm getting signals from Marion at the back. So thank you all very much for coming, and
thank you very much for coming and listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Photo, video, drone, available for hire. Check out cdfimages.com.